So we are all discussing the Ukrainian social networks are kind of outburst with the photos with the new police coming, and I'm not able to do that on my own, so I really ask to show it from the gallery. So there is a big story that the new Patrol Police is working since more or less yesterday night. That was the biggest kind of reform for showing off.
Yeah, to give it some context, this was creating a new police to take over for the traffic police. This was a reform that was very popular in Georgia that then they've been working on for a while to bring to Ukraine. And then yesterday, it exploded on social media. They had the swearing in of the different officers. People were taking selfies with the officers in a kind of a New York NYPD style uniform. And so that erupted on many people here's Facebook pages and on Twitter, and we're exposing people to that.
Because there was a lot of bitterness about the Ukrainian police used to look very, very much differently. So for today, we also have this story just by our cameraman filming it from the window. So what the police is doing, you can also show it. So they kind of help the people on the road, which was not very usual that the police help the people. It usually was vice versa. So
what I can remember last night, I saw they had TV crews out on the street because they needed footage of the new police officers in the cars at night, getting out and to help people that way. And what everyone, of course, has been noticing is there are more women in the current service than there were previously, and many attractive women as well. That's brought in a lot of comments of people asking to be arrested to give them an excuse to interact with the beautiful Ukrainian lady police officers.
But we do have a special guest. We have a New York-based photographer, Misha Friedman, who had been one of very, very few people who had been following this reform from the first days from February. Hi, Misha.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you've done the bunch of really great photos, but it's not just about photos. You're a storyteller with your photos. So tell us, how was it? So why you have chosen this story, and what is special with it for you?
Well, I first read about it in December when Hromadske was hired to do this, and it became obvious that this is important, and this is the key reform for Ukraine. So I decided I thought it would be a good idea to see it from inside, and so what I've been doing is and then I read that a record number of women applied into the police academy, and I've decided to focus on that because there has never been female traffic policemen in Ukraine ever. So the combination of those two things made it obvious. So that's what I've been doing, essentially following recruits from the very beginning of tryouts to training to now out in the streets finally today.
So we're now following Hromadske, who is a Georgian. As a deputy, currently Ukrainian citizen coming from Georgia to do that. How was working with her? I mean, she has a lot of popularity here, obviously.
Well, the other thing that was obvious, 10 years ago I happened to live in Georgia, and I remember seeing what the effect that new police had in Georgia. So,
what sort of an effect was there in Georgia?
Shock and awe, and the entire country just fell in love with the new force, and there were reality TV shows, and it was absolutely great and both funny in a very Georgian way, but also I remember how important it was for the society. Working with her was great. She's a pro. Like she knows what she's doing, and I think Ukraine is very lucky that not only that she's doing this reform right now, but her entire team. And it's not something that her team read in the book, but they're the same people who did the reform in Georgia 10 years ago. So they're applying very direct experience here
to Ukraine,
and that's just you can't get better than that.
And did they talk at all about what they had to adapt for Ukraine? Were there differences they had to take into account?
Well, I mean, Kyiv is the size of Georgia in terms of population. So it's a lot I can imagine a lot of things were easier there because everyone knows each other. You could tell by someone's surname where they're from and who their parents are. At the same time, I got the impression that they were very impressed with the quality and quantity and the enthusiasm of Ukrainians.
And maybe you can also explain, we used to show these people on training, so how are your communication with them? Who are they? We know that like youngsters, not the youngsters, we just, that is so present here, that I should explain, that somebody says like, or kind of husbands of my classmates joined to the police and all that stuff. So who are these guys? What their motivation?
Well, I think their motivation is a combination. It's almost 2,000 people, so without getting into psychoanalysis, I met all sorts of different characters, but what they do have in common is their desire to live a better life for themselves and for the country. They want to be a part of something great. They were definitely motivated by the revolution, and I mainly focused on Kyiv, so they want to live in Kyiv, they want to live a decent life, and they are motivated to try.
Were many of them coming from elsewhere to work in Kyiv as police officers?
Some, yeah. I met people from both Uzhgorod and Lugansk, so everywhere. But there were a lot of kids who, let's say, were from the provinces, recent graduates in Kyiv, maybe a year or two after their graduation, and still trying to figure out their careers or lack of. And given also how the economy has shrunk, this was kind of a decent. They saw it as an opportunity for a decent career.
And you were talking about the women in particular and how that struck you. Were their motivations different, or what was that situation
Not
like?
at all. I found I didn't really get a sense that they were somehow, that their motivation was somehow different or more feminine or, than any other cadets. Yeah.
And being an American coming from New York, how did you find it? Because there is so lots of excitement here. The uniform looks like the ones from the U.S., which is a bit funny for some people. And how is for you?
Were they made in the U.S.?
Yeah, they were made. The first part of it had been made because later they would be, copied. Yeah. Okay. So it was more.
I think it's still being made right now.
So the second part's still to come.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's you do see like American gear, and it's both funny and kind of great. And
were there American trainers as well?
There were American trainers. I spent with American trainers from California, from the Eureka, California Police Department, and they trained. Their job was to train Ukrainian trainers who would then train others. And I understood that later came police specialists from other parts of the country who then focused on basically like more senior staff. But from what I understand, more American trainers are coming to Lviv, to Odessa, and
as a New Yorker myself, it's very interesting to watch because all of this is happening at a time when kind of confidence in the U.S. and the police is probably at a record low because there's been so much violence against African Americans and, force use that's resulted in deaths and a lack of accountability. At the same time, here in Ukraine now, they're copying these uniforms. They're looking to the U.S. and to the U.S. police as a model of respect or something that can be improved. That's really interesting.
Absolutely. I was in Hromadske today, and there were a lot of people lining up to be photographed with the new police, and I don't think they've ever had this many pictures taken of them in their lives as they had today. But they were doing great. They still had a smile on, even later at night.
Well, you could see people walking around. Letting other people wear their hats, sitting with friends in the parks.
Call it selfie police. What is now the meme all over Ukrainian internet. Misha, within this year, you've been covering you've been covering the stories here for years. You've been reporting from Donetsk, from the eastern part of the country, way before it became an international topic. So we brought some of more of your stories you've done this year, for instance, about about internally displaced people. So we would like to bring them as well, about the Jews. So maybe you would explain more your stories in Ukraine about what we have. Yeah.
Well, my attitude towards Ukraine was always that it's a country with amazing stories, and sadly, there was never really any serious interest, about Ukraine until the recent events. So now this gave kind of an opportunity to not only do kind of hardcore news, but go a little bit beyond the scenes. Earlier this year, I thought that the way I work is I come up with questions and then I try to answer them with stories. So the two stories I did in January were, I read about Crimean Tatars moving to Lviv, and I asked myself, that's interesting. Like, what is it like to be a Crimean Tatar, living in Lviv? So I did a story about that. And then the second story was about Dnipropetrovsk, about the Jewish community there. Dnipropetrovsk was interesting because I met an absolutely fascinating couple who were displaced couple from Lugansk. They were Jews in their late 80s who remembered the World War II, and they were old enough to remember being moved from Lviv to Uzbekistan in 1941. And so I asked them, like, what's it like? Like, this is the second time in your life this happened to you. And because they have an absolutely unique perspective. And the response was that even then, moving to Uzbekistan, they understood what the hell was going on, like why this is happening, and the sacrifices they're making, and who the enemy was, and what side they were on. At this time, being in 75 years later, moving from Lugansk to Dnipropetrovsk, they don't get it.
They don't understand why.
They can't come up with a good answer. Like, what is this all for?
Well, and I think that's one of the really challenging things about events in Ukraine is that when you look at the people on both sides, whether it's language or appearance or religion, the differences aren't that big. And the reasons, minority groups are always hit the hardest. Certainly force people to move around. In the story that you had about the Crimean Tatars, I really loved about that because they moved to Lviv, they were there, and suddenly they started serving and selling Crimean Tatar food.
Yeah, and I was.
Yeah, that's now we can also again, because that was also the story of the prisoners of war. We were showing shortly you were doing, but now it's really the story about the synagogue in Dnipropetrovsk, and the rabbi with the.
Yeah, what was great about the Tatars is that I went there expecting to see hardship and conflict and problems.
Expect people to be sad and miserable and helpless.
And having a hard time adapting because there were never Tatars in Lviv until this year or late last year. And what I found was complete opposite. Yeah, people were not doing super well, but they were working hard. They were all doing something. They weren't blaming someone else for their problems. They were all adjusting to Lviv. They've actually found Lviv to be quite comfortable because they found locals to be a lot more religious than the Russian and Ukrainians in Crimea. So they felt a lot more comfortable about religious group than in Crimea, where I think there were more atheists and
a more secular culture.
More secular.
Sure.
And the third thing that was funny was where they bonded with the locals, where they both felt like they had a common enemy. They both could blame Moscow for something that has happened to their peoples in history. Both have been either displaced or moved from one empire to another, and there was like, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And
well, that's been one of the huge shifts. I mean, there was a time in the 90s when the Ukrainian government had made it difficult for Tatars, Crimean Tatars, who wanted to return from Central Asia, and now in the wake of Maidan and all of that, Crimean Tatars are seen as the most patriotic of the patriotic.
Yes.
And there was one also, the story, the people can, Google and find your story about the prisoners of war you were doing. But moving to other, there was some topic you were following a lot. It's about the gay and lesbians, both in Russia and in Crimea. So we'll also show some of a few photos of that, so you will tell what is your focus as well.
So I, like in the best style of selfish self-promotion, I have a book out that's now out.
What's the book called?
It's a book about a lesbian couple in St. Petersburg. Their name is Lyudmila and Natasha, and that's the title of the book. So it's a couple that I followed for about 3 years. So it's a love story about two people who just happen to be women, and it's not really directly related to like gay propaganda in Russia. This is a story that happened before, but later last year I did a separate magazine feature about a couple in Crimea who have a son from a surrogate mother, and because Crimea became Russia, they decided that they needed to move their family Ukraine away from
another group of
Sevastopol.
refugees.
Yeah.
I mean, what draws you to these groups? I mean, you've done a lot with refugees, you've done a lot with minorities.
So here is also, you can see this couple who moved to Kyiv currently from Sevastopol.
Well, prior to photography, I used to work for Doctors Without Borders, so I like the approach of that great organization. I use it in my photography in choosing my subject matters. So I'm not necessarily interested in, I don't think of them, I'm not a kind of a gay photographer, a war photographer, or a Jewish photographer. I think of vulnerable groups. So I look at news and try to think of, okay, who is the most vulnerable? And so in Crimea, to me, the two clear most vulnerable groups were the LGBT community and the drug users. And those are the two stories that, because they're different drug laws, Ukrainian laws are much more humane and tolerant, and European.
We mean specifically in terms of the methadone treatment that people could receive to help them,
so
fight addiction.
So there are about 800 drug users who could no longer receive the methadone in Crimea. And so I did a story about that, and so I tried to think in terms of vulnerable groups, and in each specific case.
But that's the way the photo, the great story of storytelling. We have photographs, and you definitely, Misha, thanks a lot for explaining us, bringing this, more human story of all what's happening in the region, both in Ukraine and Russia. We are about to over, but you can, find we are online television, so everybody is online.
Watch later, share, look at the video, share everything else, and look at Misha's photos
Twitter,
and buy his book.
Follow the links and dig more about the book Misha has and all the other stories about, corruption in Russian DNA, what was the project, another project about the patriotism in Russia. All that is available online, and we are always happy to explain more about what you're doing here.